the Rude Awakening Tour podcast.
Seats, Spark seats.
We're going to do a little relaxed format, so like I said, please feel free to interrupt, but Dr. Nevin just asked me to sort of facilitate a little chat, and so I'm going to ask him a couple of questions from my perspective just to get things going. Like I said, please feel free to jump in. So my very first question,
You're military?
ex-military, U.S. military.
Airborne as well.
Airborne, so perfect.
So what I can ask you to do something.
Well, now, hold on. I'm just a 5-jump chump, as we say. They never let me jump out of the plane again. I can tell you a story. I jumped on wrong. I have experienced just a small fraction of what's in the
Yes.
obviously.
Eight fingers.
In your career.
Five jump.
I've jumped out.
So I got, you're well versed and prepared in this, in giving your Mark I NATO standard military bio introduction in a snapshot.
Very briefly, Remington Nevin, born and raised in Toronto, Canada. My father is from Buffalo, New York. My mother's from a small town in Peterborough. I can't tell you the name, or else you'd be able to access all my online accounts. The town where she was born in secret. My father got a postcard in the mail, we think, sometime in the mid-'60s, and so decided to move to Toronto, where he raised my sister and I. And knowing that, of course, I had U.S. citizenship from birth, I at some point in my youth, I decided that I wanted to be an Army doctor. I think it's probably because I grew up watching a lot of MASH, and I thought that Hawkeye Pierce was a good role model. So after graduating from the U of T, I was lucky enough to be accepted to the U.S. military's medical school. That's just outside of D.C. on the grounds of the Bethesda Navy Hospital. Finished medical school there, went down to Fort Bragg. But by this point, I was a 5-jump chump. So I did my internship there at home of the U.S. Airborne. I think it's called Fort Liberty now. I think it's no longer called Fort Bragg. They rid the U.S. military of any trace of the Confederacy. So I think it's called Fort Liberty. It took long, that's what they did. After that, I pursued my passion, which was public health or preventive medicine. The Army was kind enough to send me to Johns Hopkins in Baltimore, so I did some additional training there. I went to the Army's Walter Reed Institute of Research, which has a storied and somewhat infamous history. We can discuss that today. Did my residency in preventive medicine there, and then got sent out to serve as an Army public health officer. Because I was airborne qualified, and because I had worked under the doctor who by this point was the 82nd Airborne's top doctor. He selected me to join them when they deployed to Afghanistan. So I flew over to Afghanistan with the 82nd Airborne headquarters element, served the better part of a year there. My tour got cut short for reasons we can discuss. And then after that, I went to Korea for a brief period. I was selected to serve in East Africa, the Horn of Africa, with forces there in Djibouti. And I finished up my career at a little post in Louisiana called Fort Polk. And that was when I published a lot of the research that I'm known for in my final years in the Army. Finished up in 2012 after 12, I think it was 12 or 14 total years in the military. Went back to Hopkins to get a doctoral degree in public health and get a few more credentials to assist me in doing the work, which by then I'd become very interested in, which of course we're going to discuss today. I currently live in a small town in Michigan, in St. Clair County, where I'm working as, well, at least for now, working as the a medical officer for the health department there. But we are thinking of relocating. We have plans to relocate a little bit further west to Illinois. We can talk about that perhaps later today. I recently became an orphan. Both my parents passed away in the last few years. So we can talk about that. So that's pretty much me. Not terribly interesting. I'm happy to entertain questions about anything as we go on.
Surely there must be one question. No, okay,
No.
that's good. That's why I'm here to ask.
Or when was your interest in Mefloquine?
There you go. Thanks.
When did that come out? When did you?
Yeah. Well, yeah, I'm often asked this, and I do have an interesting story. So we all became exposed to Mefloquine in one interesting way or another. My experiences were, let's see. So it would have been late 2006. It would have been perhaps right after Christmas. So, the 82nd headquarters element was deploying to Afghanistan right around the holidays. I think we had time to spend Christmas with family, but soon after, I don't know if it was today or soon after, we were basically at the Green Ramp, which is the area there at Fort Bragg where you get kitted up before you get on the planes to jump out. But we were using the Green Ramp to get on the charter plane to deploy us over to Afghanistan. For folks that don't know how the U.S. military deploys overseas today, it's really interesting. You go to the armory. Well, you have all your bags. You get your duffel bags and stuff, and then you go to the armory. You draw your weapon. You don't get issued ammo, but you draw your weapon, and then you go to the flight line, and there's a commercial flight that they've chartered waiting for you, right? So you don't go through TSA or anything. You just get your rifle or your sidearm, and you load up your carry-on bags, and you're sitting there on a commercial charter with your rifle, right? getting served dinner by the flight attendants. It's a little odd. So we were going to fly straight to Manas, Kyrgyzstan, but there was bad weather there, so we stopped in Germany, put us up on a luxury. It's good to fly with the general because instead of being put up at a Motel 6 or something, they put us up at a fancy hotel in downtown. I don't know where we were exactly. Stayed there a few days until the weather cleared, flew on to Manas, and then on to Afghanistan. Now, Mefloquine, where does this come in? As we were boarding the charter flight, that's when we were issued our Mefloquine. So we were all just sitting there waiting to get on the charter flight. And my boss, the top doctor, Colonel Johnson, I believe, he stands up on one of the benches and he says, "All right, look, we got this medication. Now keep in mind, what month is this? This is December, right? So I think it had just sprinkled a little bit of snow here in Fort Bragg, and it was certainly snowing where we were going." He stands up on a bench and he says, "All right, we got this medication for you here. We're going to give you a bottle of this stuff. Start take a pill now, and then just take a pill every week." And I don't recall verbatim what he said, but he didn't go into any great detail about the instructions for safer use of the drug. And he was very dismissive, I think, of some of the known, in retrospect, some of the known adverse effects of the drug. He basically said, "Yeah, this might give you some bad dreams, might disturb your sleep a little bit, you might get a little nauseated. Don't worry about it, drive on, suck it up. You got to take this so you don't get malaria." Now again, keep in mind, this is December in Fort Bragg, and we're going over to Afghanistan, where our flight is being delayed because of snow, right? So this is just some context for that. It provides some context for the military's very casual and comfortable use of this drug, right? For a drug, we know now how dangerous it is. The military is very comfortable using it. Now, at that point, because I'd been trained in Army doctrine and because I'd been at the Walter Reed Army Institute of Research and I was at U.S. military medical school before, I was taught, which was doctrine, that this drug, which the military had developed, was perfectly safe and effective. And of course, there were some reports of some side effects, but don't worry about those people. We developed this drug. We know it's essential. It's very good, and we should encourage people to take it. So how I ended up getting my Mefloquine was that on the way out the door of the Green Ramp to get on the charter flight, I was basically told, "Hey, reach in this garbage bag here and just pick out a bottle of Mefloquine." And so I just picked out some random bottle of Mefloquine, and it had some other soldier's name on it. It had been prescribed. There was a roster of everyone in the unit that had been sent to the pharmacy, and they printed out a bunch of labels and stuck them on bottles, but they didn't bother. people. They just threw them. They literally sent the privates over to the pharmacy with the pickup truck and a couple of garbage bags, and I don't know how garbage bags full of this stuff, right? Which in retrospect is kind of telling, right? They put it in garbage bags, which if only they had done that literally
And left it there.
and left it there years earlier. But yeah, they came so close. They came so close.
So I really resonate with
Yeah.
two things you said. You said dismissive
Dismissive.
and casual. So
Casual.
Similar experience for myself.
Yeah.
It was very dismissive and casual. In fact, I didn't even have a label. We were just given a bottle this year
Right.
and told you might have some nightmares that you're nodding your head because you were there too. It was very dismissive and casual. I had no label in my particular case. And once a week you might have nightmares. Don't worry about it. You'll be fine.
Right.
And so that brings me to my question, which is what should I have been told when I was given that?
Yeah.
Because
Right.
for me it was, if you don't take it, you're not going, and if you're not going, you're probably
Right.
your career is going to go in a direction you don't want. And I wanted to go. But that was why I had signed up. So
Right.
for me, ignorance was bliss, I guess, or not bliss. And it's like, sure, okay. They said it's just some nightmares again. So what should I have been?
Yeah, so I suppose there's a couple ways of answering that question, right? There's what should you have been told with the benefit of everything we know today, right? What ideally in a perfect world, with perfect knowledge, with perfect foresight, what should you have been told? But perhaps from a more pragmatic or legal perspective, I will answer the question from the perspective of, given what was known, given what had been written, given what policies and procedures and regulations and laws were in place then, and given the state of the science at the time, what should you have been told? Now, so that will depend on the specifics, right? So what I should have been told, based on that standard in 2006, might vary somewhat.
Yeah.
Perhaps not in the most important details, but in some of the
Fair enough.
tangential details from what you should have been told. So tell me more about when and where and under what circumstances you were given the drug. What year was this?
99.
1999.
Okay, it's a little hazy, but it was prior to arriving in theater. There was a
East Timor.
East Timor. Okay, so we sailed there. It takes a month or so to get there,
Okay.
and a few million liters of fuel.
Right.
But so prior to arriving in theater, I can't remember what I guess loading dose is the term that's used. But so prior to arriving, it was take this once a week,
Okay.
and if you have nightmares, don't worry about it. They'll it'll go away, and that was
Okay.
it. So
All right. So you
that was
were
once a week.
so you were on a Canadian flag vessel. I assume Canadian law applies on a Canadian flag.
Yes.
Vessel. Okay. So you were in Canada, essentially.
We were, yeah.
And presumably they had obtained this Larium from the Canadian pharmacy back wherever home port was.
Sure.
Right. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So, and I would need to consult my files to know specifically. So please don't quote me on the specifics. But if I recall correctly, in 1999 in Canada, I believe the only form of the drug that was available. Well, perhaps there was two. APO might have been producing a drug, but most likely you were given the Roche formulation of Larium.
Sure.
But most likely you were given Larium. Do you recall that it come in a sort of a silvery blister pack, or was it in a bottle? Do you recall?
It was in a little brown bottle, right?
It was in a brown bottle. Oh, okay.
Brown bottle. Somebody probably popped one in the mouth. And
Okay.
put it in bottles and-
There were some silver packages.
Sure. Maybe.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay.
But memory's not great.
Right. So there, as I recall, and the packaging is very important because some service members don't have, they couldn't attest to being given Mefloquine or Larium, but they do recall sort of a white once a week tablet.
Yeah.
So it's important to inquire of what details. So there are some soldiers I think that have reported taking a drug that was in a sort of a brown bottle with maybe a greenish or white label. I believe that's Larium. I believe Larium may have come packaged that way. But more commonly, Larium was packaged either in a sort of a gold tinged thin, well, not a blister pack, a foil pouch initially, and then I think they changed to a blister pack. I think Roche changed to a blister pack. And by blister pack, I mean there's usually foil on one side and sort of a plastic form shaped, see-through, typically see-through on the other side. But regardless, so if you were given Roche branded Larian in 1999, I believe at the time there was a warning on that label that said two words to the effect that if you are taking this drug prophylactically for prevention of malaria, if you develop psychiatric symptoms, and depending on the time and place, they are more or less explicit in listing what specific symptoms are included in among psychiatric symptoms. But anxiety, depression, restlessness, and confusion have been typically included among the symptoms that the drug manufacturer Roche has said essentially require the drug's immediate discontinuation. And if you and depending on the time and the place, there will also be an additional warning that essentially says, well, why? In order to prevent the development of a more serious event. This is so critical. This is so critical. They have been, Roche's attorneys have essentially been warning all along that there are some people that, when they take this drug, manifest evidence of a personal intolerance or susceptibility. And that personal intolerance or susceptibility can't be identified in advance. And the only way to know if someone is particularly susceptible or sensitive to the neurotoxic effects of this drug is simply to give it to them. And if they develop these symptoms, which I believe Roche used the term prodromal to describe these symptoms.
What is it?
So, well, now this
wasn't a good question.
This is very well, so what does it mean for? And let's just assume it, and I will reserve the right to correct myself on this, but I believe in 1999, I believe the Canadian product label said words to the effect that anxiety, depression, restlessness, and confusion either may be or must be considered prodromal to a more serious event. And if so, the drug must be stopped. Yes.
So just Jeff, that brown bottle, did it have any of those warnings or anything on it?
Don't believe it did. I'm sorry, my memory is pretty
No,
vague, but my impression and memory was that
Yeah,
bottle
and-
was not manufacturer's bottle. It was like, okay, let's get 150 gram bottle.
And the blister packs, they didn't have warnings on them either.
I never received a warning other than you might have some nightmares. Don't worry about it. That's normal.
And that was my last question was, did anybody ever sit you down or say to you, by the way, as if, you know, when you go to your doctor now and they give you medication,
It was as a
you
group.
know, they
we were
tell you
generally
those side
told-
effects, right?
Yeah, we were just
None
generally
of that.
told, yeah, you're gonna have some nightmares and you might be a little loopy. Don't worry about it. It's fine.
Yeah, and you're on your way to a war zone. So if
Yeah.
you're having anxiety and anxious and
I'm
you're
focused on getting there and it's like, yeah, whatever, I'll take that. So whether I was provided a warning or not, I don't remember ever seeing one.
Yeah.
Certainly was, from what I've later learned from listening to some of your talks and such, is that you should have discontinued and you should have, and none of that.
Yeah, the question was for the people in the room too, right? They're thinking,
Yeah.
I wasn't told, I had no warning.
Yeah, thank you, excellent question, and I certainly wasn't, and I would imagine that a lot of people probably were not, and even if they did get a bit of a warning, it was, what were your words, casual and dismissive?
Irresponsible.
Irresponsible, that's the legal term, thank you. So, yeah, and I was gonna ask you a question about, you said some people, who are they?
Oh, okay. Yeah.
You
So
sort of
let's,
alluded to that,
yeah.
it's hard to tell.
So let's go back. The question was, what should I have been told? Right? What sort of information would a competent and caring and concerned physician acting ethically and responsibly, ensuring your full and informed consent to use of medication? What should a physician have told you? So at the very least, they should have shared whatever important warnings were in the drug label. And so as we were saying, at that time, 1999 in Canada, I believe the warnings included this. It may not have been emphasized. This may not have appeared in bolded text. It may not have had a box around it. But I think anyone who read that label carefully taking taking this language seriously, would have identified this particular phrase and thought this is of particular importance, even if it was buried deep in the product label. I think a reasonable physician would have said, this is important enough for me to take notice of and emphasize to my patient. So what you should have been told at the very least, which was in the product insert, was during prophylactic use, meaning to prevent malaria, if while taking this drug you develop psychiatric symptoms such as anxiety, depression, restlessness, or confusion, these either must be or may be considered prodromal to a more serious event. Keep those words in mind. In which case the drug must be immediately discontinued and replaced with presumably a different anti-malarial drug, because you're going somewhere where you need the anti-malarial. So you asked me, what does prodromal mean? So I consulted the Oxford English Dictionary to inquire of the definition. And it ends up that a prodromal, as it is defined by the Brits at Oxford, is that a symptom that is prodromal is essentially one that precedes and predicts the inevitable development of some more severe or serious condition, right? So the drops of urine that you might see in your urine stream in the morning might be prodromal to the discovery of bladder cancer, in my mother's case, unfortunately. It means an early sign of something that is going to happen, right? As opposed to something like a precursor symptom, right? Which might not necessarily indicate the inevitable development of something like that. Okay, so there's the word prodromal, which at least implies, by conventional definitions, the inevitable development of something more serious. There's that word, which is already problematic in the mornings. And then there's that interesting phrase, a more serious event. Well, so let me ask you something. Anxiety, depression, restlessness, confusion. What could be more serious than those symptoms? What is more serious than anxiety? What is more serious than depression? What is more serious than confusion, which is a sign of fairly significant cognitive impairment? What is more serious than restlessness, which includes things like completely impaired sleep, horrendous nightmares? What could be more serious than those things? Well, if you look through the product insert, you see a number of other adverse effects which the drug company has acknowledged do occur with use of the drug. Psychosis, homicide, suicidal ideation, suicide attempt, completed suicide, toxic encephalopathy, and various neurological problems. So they knew all along that if you are taking this drug at a dose of once a week for prevention of malaria, and you develop any of these symptoms, this very well could be the only warning sign that you get that you are susceptible to the neurotoxic effects of this drug, and that you are already well on your way, if you haven't already, to developing a fulminant toxic encephalopathy that could lead to even more serious symptoms, including psychosis, acts of violence, and permanent neurological effects. Right? And that at the onset of those symptoms, you must immediately seek medical attention and stop taking the drug. Those are pretty important warnings to not have been given in your case. Mm-hmm. Don't you think?
Absolutely.
Yeah. Oh, by the way, if I might say, Dave Bona is about to ask a question, and sorry. Victoria's beautiful. We're here in Victoria, BC. It's very nice. Ingrid and I, my girlfriend Ingrid, my long-suffering girlfriend Ingrid, we were flying in, and I was busy with my book, and I just happened to glance out the window, and my goodness, we're here. It's beautiful, absolutely. The natural beauty, the impressive feats of nature that we saw out our window, the beautiful water and the mountains and the bays. As impressive as the natural wonders of BC are, these pale in comparison to the natural wonder that is Dave Bona's new beard.
By BC, Dave is not from here, but by British Columbia standards, I think that qualifies as old growth. Now that I've roasted you, Dave. Now that I've roasted you, Dave, please stand up and show off your beard and ask your questions.
And it all started with me not shaving for 3 days and the wife reaching over, oh, I like that. But still here. Could you just elaborate on what toxic encephalopathy is?
Oh, excellent. Yeah, thank you. So
Cross that one.
well, so I suppose in simplest terms, that is what this disease process is. It is a toxic encephalopathy. So this is essentially synonymous with the condition we're describing today. Encephalopathy, in the broadest sense, is merely a dysfunction of normal brain physiology. So when someone is suffering from an encephalopathy, the brain organ is not working as it should. And it's not working as it should for potentially a variety of reasons, right? There could be some sort of a global dysfunction of normal receptor processes, right? We've all heard of neurotransmitters and so on. So the neurotransmitter system might be dysfunctioning in some way. There could be a global inflammatory process leading to widespread dysfunction of normal brain function. There could be an autoimmune process that's causing similar effects. But the most common cause of encephalopathy, I believe, is typically just a toxicant, either a toxin, a naturally produced toxicant, or an exogenous toxicant, things like drugs or heavy metals. And in fact, in my field, I mentioned earlier during my biography, I went back and studied a number of things at Hopkins, including occupational medicine. And I learned in occupational medicine that there's a long history for well over 100 years of physicians recognizing certain occupations put you at risk of various forms of toxic encephalopathy. We're all familiar with the story of the Mad Hatter, right, from Alice in Wonderland. It ends up that hatters, folks that made hats out of felt, they used mercury vapor in the process of felting. And mercury vapor, when exposed to that over a prolonged period, you develop a heavy metal toxic encephalopathy that leads to a recognizable constellation of symptoms known as erethism, the Mad Hatter syndrome, right? So that's a form of toxic encephalopathy. If you happen to work in various smelting industries, you might be exposed to lead and lead fumes, in which case you'll develop plumbism or lead toxic encephalopathy, right? Children that live particularly in inner cities and eat paint chips growing up, they will develop lead encephalopathy as children, and that will be associated with low IQ and so on. And then if you work around fuels or degreasers, if certain occupations in the military, you may be exposed to solvents, and so you can develop solvent encephalopathy. If you work around diesel fumes or jet fuel, you can develop jet fuel encephalopathy, jet fuel psychosis. So it's not at all uncommon in various occupational settings for people to be at risk of various types of recognizable encephalopathies. And the signs and symptoms that manifest with different types of toxic encephalopathies vary a little bit, right? So erethism, Mad Hatter's disease, it's a little bit different than lead encephalopathy. Lead encephalopathy largely affects cognition. We think it can make you a little bit more violent, but it's not typically associated with the types of symptoms that describe Mad Hatter's disease. That is a little more, there's unusual personality, strange traits, cluster B traits associated with erethism. So toxic encephalopathy from Mefloquine similarly manifests with a somewhat unique constellation of signs and symptoms. It's recognizable to those that are familiar with it. So the toxic encephalopathy that the drug manufacturer was describing in the product insert at the time that you were given the drug in 1999, this had been reported in the literature. And the characteristics of this toxic encephalopathy were prodromal sleep disturbances, including nightmares, insomnia, building to include anxiety, perhaps a little depression, and then with increasing dose or use or time, including cognitive impairment, manifesting as confusion, right? And occasionally associated with neurological symptoms such as dizziness or ringing in the ears or paresthesias. Okay. So that is the toxic encephalopathy that was being described. I have, if these symptoms develop during use and then completely resolve after you discontinue the drug, then it would be medically accurate to describe that as an acute toxic encephalopathy. Acute because it lasts just a few weeks, and then on discontinuation of the drug it resolves. So there's no chronicity, there is no sequelae, so that would be an acute, fully reversible encephalopathy. For many years, many Mefloquine veterans have been told, well, these side effects are temporary and they don't last. What is being implied is that the encephalopathy caused by the drug is acute only. It's not subacute, it's not chronic. We know now that's not correct, right? Drug regulators around the world have acknowledged that an acute encephalopathy, the prodromal symptoms, anxiety, depression, restlessness, confusion, that suggest the drug must be stopped, those acute symptoms of toxic encephalopathy, unfortunately generally don't fully resolve, and that even with immediate discontinuation, the encephalopathy becomes subacute and potentially chronic. And so on discontinuation of the drug, if you're left with a residual dysfunction in the brain, then you're now suffering a chronic encephalopathy, a chronic toxic encephalopathic effect. Sorry for the long explanation, but these concepts are a little complicated. And I see this has led to a question.
Yeah, I've got a question for you, Doug. Unfortunately, I didn't bring the package today, but I'll have it tomorrow. Because in my case, I took it in 2002. Now, the package I had expires 2004. Now, I did get the silver blister pack type, right? Because I ended up on the worst part of the spectrum of what it can do to you. I never finished them. But we were told when we got back that you have to take these for another 8 weeks. So I want to know that specific Lariam drug. We're not in theater anymore. Did I even need to start putting these? Because I refused to because of what happened to me. So I still have the pills, I still have the box, and I'll bring it. I forget what's written on it. I don't know if it was an insert, but is that part of it? Like, let's suppose this drug had no side effects, but it really worked for malaria. Do you have to take it for another 8 weeks when you get back, or you're going to catch malaria?
Right, I understand. Okay, so why don't we just briefly discuss what malaria is? Sure. And then how militaries have dealt with the threat of malaria, and why antimalarials are dosed the way they are. Does that sound good? Okay. So now, of course, in my case, when we deployed to Afghanistan in the winter of 2006, there probably weren't very many mosquitoes that were flying around and fighting, right? So the risk of malaria was probably low at that point. That's an understatement. But let's just assume that for the sake of argument, where you were going, what was an area where there was some circulating malaria, and so some protection against malaria might not have been released. Let's just assume. So the way Western militaries have preferentially protected their troops against malaria since World War I. Has been through the use of prophylactic schizonticidal antimalarials. So that's a mouthful. So let's go through that. The malaria parasite is transmitted by the female Anopheles mosquito. The mosquitoes suck your blood, feed on your blood, find a wall to hang out on, and they'll eventually grow their eggs and release their eggs, and the life cycle will start over again. In the process of a mosquito landing on you and injecting its proboscis into your skin, there will be in an infected Anopheles mosquito, there will be little tiny sporozoids. So one particular life cycle stage of the malaria parasite, they migrate to the salivary glands of the mosquito so that they can catch a ride as the proboscis inserts into your skin. And so these little sporozoids make their way into your skin and they migrate to a blood vessel. And they're very good at this. The malaria parasite is very well evolved. The malaria parasite will then catch a ride to the liver, where it will mature in the liver for a number of days. And then once it's finished maturing in the liver, it'll bust out of the liver in search of red blood cells again. And it'll infect the red blood cells and use the hemoglobin in your blood to multiply and grow. And then after the red blood cell has been eaten up, essentially, the red blood cell will burst, and all of these schizones will emerge into the bloodstream, where they will cause you to become sick. This is what's dangerous because you're having this toxic reaction to all of the cytokines and everything that's being released in response to this parasitic infection. And so you'll become tired and fatigued. You'll get a fever, and you won't want to move around. You'll just want to lay around. And if you happen to be in an area where there are a lot of mosquitoes, you're not going to have the energy to swat the mosquitoes because you're sick. You know, you have 104 fever, you feel tired, and so you're going to want to sit outside where the mosquitoes are, and you're not going to want to swat the mosquitoes away. And so conveniently for the parasite, it's very highly evolved. Parasites influence human behavior to effect their survival. Right? We could have an interesting discussion about how diarrhea assists parasitic
Let's not.
reproduction. We'll save that until afterwards.
Yeah, after lunch.
And then wait till you hear what sexually transmitted parasites do to you. That's the subject for another day. But anyway, so you're lethargic, and now large numbers. Oh, and you're also breathing out a lot of carbon dioxide. You're breathing out pheromones and attractants that attract even more mosquitoes. The mosquito says, this person's sick. And so the mosquitoes come and feed on you. And it so happens that there are the sexual stages of the parasite, the gametocytes, in your blood. And when the malaria parasite lands on you and takes a blood meal, it sucks up all of those gametocytes, which are the sexual stage, and then they undergo reproduction in the body of the mosquito, and then they eventually make their way to the proboscis and the salivary glands, and the cycle starts all over. Okay, but that's beside the point. So we can use drugs to try to attack various life cycle stages of the parasite. Now, the best place to attack the malaria parasite from a drug discovery perspective is when it's in the liver, right? Because once the parasite's made its way into your skin, migrates to the liver where it undergoes its initial few days of growth, it's not making you sick at this point. You're not infectious. You can't make someone else sick because the liver parasite's isolated in your liver. Excuse me, this side. That's your heart. Liver's in this side. Dr. Nevin. That's his side. I passed anatomy. Liver, spleen, heart. Okay, good. So the very best place to attack the malaria parasite would be while it's developing in your liver, because if you can get it in the liver, you're not yet infectious to others. And by infectious, I mean a mosquito can't bite you and transmit it ultimately to someone else. Malaria is not directly infectious person to person. And if you can kill a parasite in the liver, you do so before it's made you sick, right? If you wait until the parasite's made its way into the blood, then potentially you could get sick because the malaria parasite, once it gets into your blood, that's how it makes you sick. But unfortunately, since World War I, since we began using quinine, that natural extract of the cinchona tree, the cinchona bark, quinine is a schizonticide only. It only kills the form of the parasite in the blood cells. It's a schizonticide. It works, but it's not ideal. In World War II, the U.S. military searched for alternative antimalarials, and for whatever reason, they focused again on schizonthicidal agents. So chloroquine was the product of the World War II drug discovery effort. There was a similar drug, quinacrine, or atabrine, which is structurally related to chloroquine, which was widely used in World War II. It had been developed earlier. And like chloroquine and like quinine, it's also a schizonticide. Chloroquine, quinacrine, you can probably guess what type of drug Mefloquine is. Any guesses? It's a schizonticide. So Mefloquine is a schizonticide only. And so when you take Mefloquine, what you're doing is instead of killing the new malaria parasites that might enter your skin, travel to your liver, harmlessly grow at that point before they enter your bloodstream, instead of killing the parasite then, we just ignore it at those early stages. We let it build up, to large numbers in the blood, and then we attack. Right? Not very efficient from a military perspective. You kind of want to go after your enemy at an earlier stage, right? When they're preparing to attack you, not when they're like imminently about to attack. But that's what we do. Mefloquine, we just wait till the very last moment to kill the parasite. So we take the military prescribed Mefloquine, thinking that you give a large dose of this drug that tends to stick around in the tissues, right? It tends to depot in the fatty tissue. And then hopefully there'll be enough of the drug in your system that it'll ooze out into your blood and kill the parasites as they're infecting the red blood cells, right? So the reason they recommend you start Mefloquine a few weeks early, typically 4 weeks, but really it probably should be 6 to 8 weeks before you're exposed to malaria parasites, is so that the drug is at high enough levels in the blood to be an effective schizonicide and kill all the parasites that might enter your blood or that might get into that might go on to infect other red blood cells after they've matured. If you stop taking Mefloquine the day you leave the malaria area, so think about this. If you stop taking Mefloquine the day you leave the malaria area, let's say the levels of the drug start declining at that point, right? If you were bit by a mosquito on the very last day you're leaving the malaria area, it might take a week or so for that malaria parasite to make its way to the liver, mature, migrate, leave the liver, and so the thinking is that to guard against the potential of a malaria infection from those straggler parasites, that you need to keep taking the schizonicide for 30 days, 4 weeks-ish, so that you have high enough levels of the schizonicide in your blood to kill any of those straggler parasites. That's the reason why militaries have traditionally said you need to keep taking chloroquine, Mefloquine for a number of weeks after you leave the malaria area. It's because it's really not an optimal drug for prevention of malaria. What would be a better drug? So a better drug would be a drug that kills a malaria parasite in the liver, right? That would be a much better drug, right? Because if you could kill a malaria parasite in the liver before it develops the ability to infect blood cells, then not only is there no risk of that person contributing to onwards transmission of malaria, but there's no way that you're going to get sick, right? Because it's going to sop up all the malaria parasite before they escape into the blood. And the advantage of giving a drug that kills malaria parasite in the liver is that you can pretty much stop taking it when you leave the malaria endemic area, right? Mm-hmm. Yeah. So we've had those drugs for quite some time, right? A drug called Malarone, atovaquone proguanil, kills the malaria parasite in the liver. It has schizonicidal properties, but it also has the ability to kill the protozoites or the myrizoites in the liver stage parasites, which are a much better target for drug action.
Were those drugs around in
Yes.
2000?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
If I could go back in time, I wish I got malaria.
Well, yes. And many. So it ends up that there are many ways to prevent malaria. There are many rational, reasonable ways to prevent malaria. If I was sitting across from a prospective traveler and we were talking about how to prevent malaria, depending on the circumstances of travel, depending on the risk posed by malaria, and depending on your personal risk tolerance, and depending on how well you as a patient might be able to accommodate various forms of treatment, I might say, look, the risk of malaria where you're going, it's not zero, but this is not an imminent risk. You can't get malaria unless you get bitten by an infected mosquito. And not every mosquito is infectious. And in actual fact, it takes more than just 1 or 2 mosquito bites to get malaria typically. You need more than one virus or one bacteria to get the illness that those viruses or bacteria cause. You need a certain infectious dose. And so as long as you can minimize the risk of mosquito bites, maybe you can wear long sleeves, maybe you can use bug spray, maybe you can just avoid going outside when the bugs are biting. And if the bugs are biting, maybe you can just swat them away, right? If you can do that reasonably, then you may not actually need to take a prophylactic anti-malarial drug, depending on where you're going, right? So long as you're aware that if you do develop a fever, that could be malaria. And as long as you immediately seek treatment at the onset of symptoms that could indicate that you did nonetheless become infected with malaria, then what would the treatment be? If we think you have malaria, it would be the same drugs that we would have been giving you for prophylaxis, right? So if I was going to give you, let's just say, 7 tablets of a certain drug to treat the malaria infection that you might develop, right? And the alternative to that would be for you to take, I don't know, 30 of the same tablet over a period to prevent malaria. What makes more sense?
I have a quick question that's on somebody that's watching this
excellent.
live.
Nice.
Says, why do the general public not need to take all these medications when we travel to these places?
Well, so I would encourage anyone listening who is traveling to a malaria endemic area, or really anyone who's traveling to the tropics, to consult with a travel physician before they travel, right? Because there are diseases, both infectious and non-infectious.
I think they're talking about methadone.
Well, okay, so very few travel medicine physicians today will prescribe Mefloquine. Most travel medicine physicians, most family doctors, most doctors who are consulted by prospective travelers will prescribe Malarone, atovaquone, proguanil, because it is objectively a better drug. It's safer. It has a broader mechanism of action. It kills the liver forms of the parasite in addition to serving as a schizonicide. It's obviously much better tolerated, and it's simply more convenient. You can start taking it the day of travel. You can take it 1 or 2 days before travel if you want to be extra safe. It's also very tolerant of missed doses. You can miss a few days of Malarone and just double up or triple up if you happen to miss those days. So it really is. It's as close to a perfect antimalarial as you can get. And there's really no compelling need for any alternative antimalarials besides atovaquone proguanil. It is the drug of choice for most Western militaries today. And as many veterans in other countries will tell you, it has long been the drug of choice of their more senior personnel.
Thank you. Thank you. Great.
I just want to resume. I have a question that I thought we could delve back into the conversation, but we did have somebody on Facebook that was asking, are there any internet links and stuff? And I know if you just Google search, you can find some stuff, but maybe you could share your link to your foundation.
I mentioned earlier, I've published quite a bit on this topic. A lot of my work's approaching a decade old now, but it's still pretty good, even though it's old. If you just Google my name, Remington Nevin or Dr. Remington Nevin, you'll get my website, and I have a publications page there. And academic publishing, it's really a racket. It really is a racket. These big companies make billions of dollars a year, charging universities access to these journals. And if you're just a member of the public and you want to read the scientific research, which in many cases your tax dollars have paid for, you get this paywall where you have to pay like $50 to read the journal article or the book chapter or whatever. So if you go to my website, I have all my articles linked there. Some of them are open access, but some of them are behind these god-awful institutional paywalls. So if there's a paper, and I try to describe each paper and its important findings in a little blurb, and if you find a paper that is interesting and you want to read it, just email me. And at a fair use, I'll be able to send you a copy. And if you have any questions, you can let me know. but a good chunk of the stuff that's linked there is open access. You can read it, and that should address most of your questions. I encourage every MEFCON veteran to read just about everything that's out there. And you will get most of your questions answered, or at least at that point be in a position to ask really good follow-on questions from that point.
There is now a lot of information available on your site, Mefloquine Awareness Canada. I remember years ago, there truly was nothing.
That was nothing.
And, and if it wasn't for people like yourself and Marge and Dave and Mike and stuff sharing information, I certainly would have been in a lot worse place.
I suppose to be precise, there was quite a bit of literature, right? Because the drug company the drug companies were promoting this drug, the militaries were promoting this drug, and they were doing so with all sorts of literature that really manufactured doubt about the dangers of the drug and was being used to promote the drug. I think today they would call that disinformation.
But so right now it's not the risks other than these more recently some of the groups that have formed. There really was not a lot of information in the mainstream about the risks and challenges.
Well, they're
brought together.
So
Peers.
with Mefloquine, the conclusions are so obvious. If it weren't for the efforts of various militaries and the efforts of the drug companies to manufacture doubt, to sow confusion about what is so obvious in retrospect, if it wasn't for the deliberate efforts of key scientists who were, in many cases, funded very well by Roche and by government agencies to spread this, in modern parlance, disinformation, if it weren't for their mischievous efforts, it would have been obvious all along, the problems with this drug, right? And I suppose that brings us to what we were discussing.
Yeah.
I had a question posed to me. What are the implications of these warnings, right? We started off the
I
conversation.
guess I'd want to ask,
Yeah.
what would happen if we'd been given the proper warnings that you said that
Right.
Roche and the other
That
companies
you should have been.
should have been given,
Right.
and as in a few examples we've heard from people, we certainly were not given.
Yeah.
So what would have happened or should have
Okay,
happened?
so let's work this through. Let's think about this. So in your case, 1999, had you been told now, of course, the drug company, if they're ever sued, they will say, well, we said all along. It's right here in black and white. If you're taking this drug to prevent malaria, as you were, and if you develop any psychiatric symptoms, to include anxiety, depression, restlessness, or confusion, the drug company lawyers will say, we tried to warn you. You need to stop taking the drug. And they'll say, we warned you that you could have gone psychotic. We warned you that you could have developed toxic encephalopathy. We warned you that you could have become a homicidal, raging maniac. It's right there in black and white. This is what they'll say. They'll stand up and say this. We warned you all along, right? Okay, so let's think about this. So if you were told that, if someone frankly said, look, the U.S. military developed this drug, Mefloquine. It has a pretty sordid history. If we go back in time and we study what we've known about this drug class, throughout history, but we think maybe in at least 50% of you, maybe if we're lucky, 2/3 of you, this might not be an unreasonable drug. It might not be the best drug because, as we discussed, it only kills the parasite in the blood. We could give you a better drug that kills the parasite in the liver, but we don't want to do that. So, regardless, we think this is a pretty good drug. Now, that being said, if they had simply told you this, if the doctor and the commander had sat down and said, all right, here's the drug, and here are the downsides, right? Here are the good sides. They would have said, well, now here's the problem. It's a pretty good drug for maybe half of you or 2/3 of you. But for the other half or the other third of you that we're going to give this drug to, has some pretty serious drawbacks, and let's go through these. The first drawback, the most important drawback, we'll just stick to the most important drawback. The most important drawback is, if you develop any psychiatric symptom, insomnia, vivid dreams, nightmares, anxiety, even mild apprehension, a sense of fear, a sense of foreboding, a sense of unease, really doesn't make any sense. The soldier, weeks before they deploy, even though they were shot at and so on, really the crippling and disabling nature of their psychiatric disorder is the fact that they started having these extraordinarily dystonic nightmares that have nothing at all to do with combat, soon after starting to take Mefloquine and before they deploy. That is fundamentally the nature of their disability. It's what's made them think that maybe the world would be better off if I killed myself, because then, the monster that my dreams suggest I am would not be, risking, hurting my family, right? And because nobody understands me and nobody can help me, I'm probably just better off gone anyway, right? So if the psychiatric community truly understood this, then they might question whether the diagnosis of PTSD applies. Now, fortunately or unfortunately, if a veteran doesn't have god-awful nightmares like that, thank goodness. But that's not to dismiss the severity of other potentially more conventional symptoms that they might have due to Mefloquine. But I would say it's probably a minority of cases where the circumstances of the symptom are such that it's very obvious where you can say, well, this is not PTSD. PTSD can't explain this, right? And more commonly, what you get is a mixed picture, right? Where maybe you had some vague nightmares of monsters and snakes in the weeks before deployment, and then you get overseas, and you might have been in some firefights, and you might continue to have nightmares. Some of them might be monster, demon-based. Some of them might be combat-themed and so on. And I've asked veterans this question, and this might be helpful for you to think about. I said, okay, look, post-traumatic stress disorder as a disorder is conceived of as resulting from the terror and trauma of an actual event that was so horrific, an actual event that was an actual event as you perceived it. So a threat, real or implied, that you experienced that was so horrific as to leave a lasting impression on you that leads to these recurring subsequent symptoms. Okay. So then I asked the veteran, if you had a choice, and let's say the psychiatrist had attributed all of the symptoms to one particular encounter in combat. Let's say there was some sort of contact with the enemy that they attribute your symptoms to. Okay, so ask yourself this. If you had a choice between re-experiencing the worst combat experience in real life, reliving that, or reliving the worst nightmare, experiencing the worst nightmare you've had from the drug, what would you rather experience? My experience has been that many Mefloquine veterans will say, Doc, I will take the real life combat incident any day of the week and twice on Sunday over what I experience in my dreams. Because what I experience in my dreams is completely out of my control. It's more horrific. It's more frightening. I'm completely powerless. At least the traumatic event that I supposedly experienced, according to the psychiatrist, I was in charge and it was okay. Like nothing haunts me in reality like my dreams do. I think that's a very potentially helpful way for a veteran to explore the causality of their symptoms. Now, all of this is just to further reinforce how difficult causality assessment is, right? We could probably sit and debate all day in the case of anyone's individual nightmares. Well, what is the actual cause of that? We could sit and discuss this all day. And so it's not, from a practical perspective, if the drug companies had said, look, if you experience any of these symptoms and you conduct this sort of detailed causality assessment sitting down with your psychiatrist in your off hours while you're deployed, and after 4 days debating, you decide, well, this is likely to be due to the drug, then stop taking the drug. It's very impractical to imagine doing it, which is why these instructions can only be interpreted as if you experience any of these symptoms, to including symptoms that are easily attributed to PTSD, insomnia, nightmares, anxiety, depression, restlessness, right? If you experience any of these symptoms in the first few weeks of your combat deployment, you immediately stop taking the drug. You see, no matter what the cause is of these symptoms, those instructions have to be interpreted as you must stop taking the drug. You see that, right? So to finish along this line of reasoning, I believe there are some cases of veterans who started experiencing psychiatric symptoms that could be misinterpreted as PTSD, where you can describe the history in sufficient detail, and particularly the time course of symptoms with sufficient detail, so as to reasonably exclude other psychiatric diagnoses, most significantly post-traumatic stress disorder. But there will likely be many cases where an opposing psychiatrist, like let's say this ever came, down to a legal fight, there will likely be some cases where the opposing psychiatrist could make a somewhat reasonable argument that, well, these could be purely symptoms of PTSD. And this is, if you really think about it, it's such a fascinating area to explore. And I'll give you just one example. I'll give you one example to illustrate this. So there was a veteran, because it really does raise the question, well, what is PTSD? Where did this come from? Right? Who came up with this? Who came up with the specific diagnostic criteria? So post-traumatic stress disorder, you could be diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder if you experienced an event where you perceive your life to be in danger, where you perceived your life to be in danger. It doesn't say if a reasonable person would conclude their life was in danger. It was you believed your life was in danger. But what if you are laboring under paranoid delusions where you see danger and potential threat in the most benign of circumstances? So I had one veteran who described how he had been diagnosed with PTSD. And I'll change the details a little bit for the sake of confidentiality. But essentially, on his fob, there was a third country national who was cleaning the facilities. And this fellow was a terrorist. He was a known terrorist. This fellow was, I think, in the intelligence field, and he knew this fellow was a terrorist, right? And he was being targeted by this fellow. I think he was a janitor, and so he was cleaning everything. And this fellow had to take he had to take a great effort to protect himself from this fellow who was smuggling in weapons onto the compound, who had guns under his whatever the clothing he was wearing. And he had to actually change his schedule so that he wouldn't be present when the third country national was cleaning, right? Because he was a terrorist and he was after them, right? So the psychiatrist, upon hearing this story, took great sympathy. Oh my God, that's awful. How frightening. That this bloodthirsty terrorist was right next to you. He could have entered your sleeping quarters at night. He could have killed you. You must have been a very important person to have been targeted by this third country national. They smuggled onto the base, specifically to kill you, right? The psychiatrist took him at his word and diagnosed him with PTSD based on that traumatic event, the fear of being assassinated by this terrorist killer. In actual fact, this man was delusional, right? It's a crazy story. It doesn't make any sense. Think about it. It doesn't make any sense. It doesn't make any sense at all. This man sensed danger where none was present, and yet his psychiatrist fell for it hook, line, and sinker. So he was diagnosed with post-traumatic stress disorder. But if I could sit down with his psychiatrist, I would say, look, this man was obviously psychotic. He was obviously laboring under paranoid delusional psychosis caused by the drug, right? Now the psychiatrist might say, oh yes, but according to the diagnostic criteria, if you believed that your life was in danger, whether or not the threat was actually real, and whether or not someone else would have corroborated the threat, it can still be PTSD. And so this raises all sorts of interesting questions, which myself and psychiatrists could probably sit around for days talking about. They would smoke their pipes and they'd be wearing their tweed jackets, and we would sit around and talk about Freud and our relationships with our mothers and so on. And we would explore this question, right? Like, can you develop post-traumatic stress disorder from a hallucination? If you are a tourist and you go on vacation in Zanzibar and you're sitting on the beach drinking Mai Tais, but you're laboring under the delusional paranoid effects of Mefloquine, and as you're sitting on your beach chair in Zanzibar and you watch as a skiff full of Somali pirates runs ashore with AK-47s ablaze, shooting up the beach, killing all the tourists, right? Bullets flying over your head. This is all a hallucination, by the way, right? Can you develop PTSD from the hallucination of being in a firefight? If you ask a psychiatrist that, they have not yet addressed this question. And yet this question is right in front of them because countless veterans have experienced hallucinations like that. Maybe not Somali pirates in a skiff coming ashore in Zanzibar, but maybe, right? Maybe. Maybe if vacationed in Zanzibar when you were in Somalia, you might have had a nightmare like that. But the psychiatry community has never come to terms with all of the possibilities that are created by sending troops into a combat zone where a drug they are given could cause them to experience paranoia and hallucinations and fear and symptoms like this that have nothing to do with reality. It's a fascinating question. And should that be considered PTSD or should it be considered something else? I would say it should be considered something else, but I'll concede that, maybe there's more to it than that. Follow.
Yeah, I don't want to make this situation all about me, but I mean, I told the doctors, the military doctors, what happened to me, what was going on. So that was in 2002. I was eventually medically released in 2005. So I went to ATIP, accessed information. I said, I want my whole military file. Anything that has my name on it, I want everything from the day I joined. So I go through it page by page, and then I come across this. It says from the doctor, these symptoms are likely attributed to the side effects of Mefloquine medications. He needs to be monitored. So that was in 2002.
And this was
Nobody told me.
This was when you were in theater, still on the drug.
Back in, and I told them what's going on. So they write it all down. That's great. But what does being monitored mean, or tell me what's happening or what's real? Nothing until I ended up getting released.
So let's just if the audio is not coming, let's just summarize. So you started taking Mefloquine, and while the symptoms you experienced, nothing fortunate about those. If I'm reviewing a case, 9 times out of 10, it's best for my understanding of the case.
Yeah,
for
I'll
the
just
veteran
clarify
to
for you, because when you started to redo the samples before you
deploy.
I'll give you the situation. We started taking it before we went there.
Before you
the guys were already getting the dreams, whatever, we're not even there yet. What happened with me was in the middle of the tour, I had to go back to Canada.
Okay.
But they said, you need to keep taking them, you can't break the cycle.
Right.
So I'm like, okay, so I think we were getting them distributed to us on the day.
Right.
Because I was gonna be in Canada for a longer period, they gave me the whole box.
Right.
It's like, you gotta take them, it's up to you to take them.
Right.
While in Canada,
You continue taking
boom,
it.
boom, boom,
Yeah.
everything happened.
Yeah.
Like
Numerous
incidents on top of it. But I had to go back in theater, but I didn't stop taking them.
You didn't stop
I didn't know what I was blaming.
And so where and when was that note written?
Before they send us home, they want to do a debrief, anyone got anything to say, a one-on-one? And I said, well, I think I should tell you what happened while I was in Canada.
Right.
Which I did, and he wrote it all down.
Okay.
But he just wrote it in my medical file, and off I went and got a jug of rum and 6 weeks off, and so what?
And what symptoms had you reported to that doctor?
I can't tell you here, but I'll talk to you.
But nightmares.
No, we're way past that.
It's okay.
I went into the other.
Right, but certainly anxiety, depression, restlessness, or confusion.
Not even that. No, I went into the worst possible thing. They're not even on the chart. We'll talk about it later.
Yeah. Well, so I just want to share, just from a factual basis.
These are so, like,
Right,
I can't even
I
describe as PTSD.
They were psychiatric symptoms.
Wait, yeah.
Okay, so the question is, if in theater, if you report these symptoms, and certainly in his case, I would think these would qualify, but even if you just went to your psychiatrist or your medical officer and you said, Doc, I'm having a hard time sleeping. I'm feeling anxious. I'm feeling depressed. I'm not feeling myself. Anyone taking Mefloquine who goes to their medical officer in theater and reports these symptoms, there is only one correct response from that physician. There's only one. There's only one correct response. And that is, you need to stop taking the drug. Period. That's the only correct response. There's a very simple medical term for any other response, and that's malpractice. It's malpractice for a doctor to be told that someone on Mefloquine is experiencing psychiatric symptoms, to include anxiety, depression, restlessness, or confusion, and be told you simply need to be monitored. No. You need to immediately discontinue the drug, and you need to be monitored. And what I've written is, look, because these symptoms, anxiety, depression, restlessness, confusion, must be considered prodromal. What that implies is that there's a very real possibility, if not the inevitability, that those symptoms are an early warning sign of the progression of this condition to include potentially life-threatening symptoms, such as suicidal or homicidal ideation. So if someone that experiences these symptoms and goes to their medical officer and reports these, as they should be, depending on the malaria risk, they may need to be given an alternative anti-malarial drug. Largely that can be avoided, depending on the circumstances. But they need to be monitored. You probably want to take their weapon away in most circumstances.
And see, this is what I'm getting at, is that what I was told was, instead of what you suggested was, you know that drug that's making you crazy?
Yeah.
Here's
Take
another
more.
package, you
Right.
take it for another
That's
8
right.
weeks when you're back.
Yeah.
And
So-
so,
I think I'm not an attorney, but I think the term for that is involuntary intoxication, right? Where they knew or ought to have known that you were being poisoned, intoxicated. There's a adverse effect on your psychic state from this medication. They're aware of that, and they give you more, right? It's as though you show up at the ER, obviously suffering from alcohol intoxication, and they immediately give you more. Now, there is actually, in medicine, there is a reason to give you more alcohol in those circumstances on occasion. But, generally, the cure is not more of what made you sick in the first place, in general, right? But unfortunately, that's what happened. And I think that largely, the individual clinicians involved, the individual physicians involved, they probably just didn't know any better. Had they taken the time to look into this themselves, they could have arrived at the correct answer. They could have arrived at the correct conclusion. They might have had to fight their superiors. They might have had to fight their colleagues. They might have had to go against the grain a little bit, but they could have certainly said, wait a second, this doesn't add up. I've read the label, it says this, you're telling me that we should just ignore this, right? So I'm not particularly critical of my colleagues, your fellow medical officers that in those cases didn't do the right thing, but really they ought to have done the right thing. And there are enough examples of individual clinicians over time, right, that did recognize this. There was the example of that one doctor who deployed in Somalia. Does anyone recall his name? The major. What was his name?
Dr. Passy?
Was it Passy or was Passy was the psychiatrist?
Oh, yeah.
But who was there was a family practice doc deployed in Somalia, and he's gone quiet. But his name appears in much of the Somalia Commission materials. He figured it out. He knew that these symptoms were problematic, and I hope that he did instruct certain service members to discontinue the drug. For what it's worth, I'm hardly heroic in this matter, but I looked into this during my deployment, and it took me a few months, but I did realize, wait a second, we have a problem here, and we did start inquiring of our unit, hey, are you experiencing these symptoms? Well, maybe you want to stop taking the drug, and had I been a little more aggressive with that line of reasoning, I think I would have faced, a lot more pushback, but it was not an entirely unreasonable thing to suggest, right? But really, where does the responsibility lie? The responsibility for this lies not at the level of each individual medical officer who was being told the official party line by docs higher up. It was the higher up docs. It was the higher up policymakers, the folks in Canada was it Department of National Defense at the time? They knew or ought to have known, right? Because fundamentally, they're the ones issuing guidance to the frontline docs. They certainly, at the time, they should have known, right? And they should have promulgated guidance down the chain of command and didn't, right? Yeah.
So go ahead if you have questions.
So I know the question's been asked once or twice, but I don't know if you want to go down that rabbit hole yet, is what was their ulterior motive to continuing to give this to people?
Well,
That may be that case.
right. So
so,
If I may add on to that too, please. Has there been any acknowledgement of this negligence from DND DOD down in the States or any government body so far?
Well, so now keep the context in mind, right? So the veterans in many jurisdictions are taking various forms of legal action against either the governments or in some cases individual doctors, depending on the context. In the civilian world, there have been a number of cases where individual civilian plaintiffs have taken action against individual doctors for failing to warn. And I believe, from my perspective as a doctor, being asked the question, well, what was the standard of care? Or what should have been done, right? It's very obvious that there was a gross failure, right? A gross failure to recognize what was written in black and white all along, right? And we're all familiar with the idea of the boxed warning, the black box warning, right? Fundamentally, what a boxed warning is not inherently new information. When drug regulators put a boxed warning on something, they're not necessarily adding new information. They're not saying, oh, we used to think the drug was safe, and now we're pointing out it's not safe. That's not necessarily what's happened. What they're often saying is there was information that we knew all along that was buried in the product insert. And now, because we thought this was enough. We thought this was enough for you, the doctor, to read this, take notice of it, pay attention to it, and counsel your patients appropriately. We thought it was enough. Oops, we goofed, our mistake. Now we're going to pull it out of that section buried on page 4 out of 15 in the label, and we're going to put it right on top, and we're going to bold face it, and we're going to put a big box around it. A boxed warning, right? That's essentially what happened in 2013 in America. They essentially took information that was already in the label, and they just said, hey, pay attention to this. You guys haven't been paying attention. Please pay attention to it. What a boxed warning does is it makes it more difficult for a doctor to claim ignorance. It makes it more difficult for the pharmacist to claim ignorance. They really should have known all along. But people being people, busy practice, 5-minute appointments, So the box warning draws attention to important information that may or may not have previously been identified. And in 2013, what the box warning primarily said was, hey, if you take this drug and you experience any symptoms, you must immediately stop taking the drug. And we know this was fundamentally the important information accompanying that change because in Europe, that box warning was accompanied by a checklist that was put out by the drug makers. It basically reiterated this. It asked the question, here's a checklist for prescribers to use before they prescribe the drug. Have you counseled your patient that when taking this drug, if you experience any psychiatric symptoms, to include insomnia, nightmares, anxiety, depression, restlessness, or confusion, you must stop taking the drug, right? So it's obvious. But arguably, we should have known this all along. Your doctor should have known this all along, right? So how can anyone, how can any organization, how can any doctor claim that they had no idea, that they shouldn't have known, right? They might say, well, look, the product label's really big, and we didn't have time to go through every line, and Roche was funding authors to publish journals and in between skiing in the Alps, with their large payments, for their work, they were publishing these articles that said, oh, don't worry about these symptoms. Maybe the travelers are just taking drugs, and it's all in their heads, right? So there was this manufactured doubt, they might claim, and so they didn't know anything. But if you read the label, it's right in there. I mean, it says unequivocally, if you're taking the drug and you experience these symptoms, you must stop. How do you argue with that? So I suppose when it's so obvious, right? Like when it's so obvious that you've made an error, and maybe they all realize this in retrospect, but when it's so obvious that you've committed an error, unless you're willing to get your checkbook out and write a very, very, very big check, I would think the only response is to deny it, right? I mean, and I suppose to some extent, these folks feel that they have some sort of fiduciary duty to the government to protect against a massive payout, right? I mean, I recall I was in DC And I was speaking with an old colleague of mine who by this point had separated from the military, and he was working at a very high level at the VA, at the Department of Veterans Affairs. And in our conversations, he casually admitted that the U.S. military had made a very big mistake about this drug. Essentially, he, privately to me, had conceded what many veterans have been hoping all along, that some government official would simply get up behind a podium and say, look, we got to come clean, we goofed, you know. But what he said, this was telling, right? What he said was, look, Rem, he called me Rem, he said, Rem, what would you have us do, right? If we do what you say we should do, then we would essentially be inviting every veteran in the country who's ever deployed to drive their pickup truck to Fort Knox and back up the bed to the loading dock and just shovel, you know, a couple scoops of gold into everyone's pickup truck, because the payout is going to be unimaginable. The extent and severity of the malpractice is beyond comprehension. This was essentially what he was telling me. He was saying, because of what a massive mistake this was, the only thing we can do is deny it and continue to cover it up. And there's an expression, at least in the United States, I don't know if you share it here in Canada, but because of this tension, because of this almost fiduciary duty that government doctors and government policymakers have to protecting the public's purse, because of this sense of duty, because they don't want to be responsible for bankrupting their employer, there's this understanding among veterans that it is the unstated policy of the VA to, we can all say it together, delay, deny, wait until they die.
Yeah.
Right? Delay, deny, wait till they die. And from their perspective, every month they can forego admitting the massive negligent nature of what they've done. They save hundreds of millions of dollars, right? Right, because some veterans inevitably take their lives, right, out of frustration or impatience or for whatever. And so there's $1 million they've just saved, right? Or 2 million with inflation, maybe 3 at this rate, maybe 10 at this rate, or 100 if you've studied Weimar Germany, but that's a subject for another day. And short of suicide, an accepted claim, an accepted disability claim might be $2,000, $4,000 a month, you know, averaged over how long? So the more they can wait for that reckoning, the more money they can save. And I suppose, you know, by some sort of perverted logic, they might say, well, look, there's only so much money, and we have to care for lots of veterans. And if we bankrupt the VA taking care of these Mefloquine veterans, we're not going to have any for the Vietnam veterans, we're not going to have any for the Korean veterans, yada, yada, yada. You know, so it might be a purely pragmatic, sort of Machiavellian kind of decision.
The accompanying of lack of honor and disrespect.
Well, so those are not common characteristics among senior Defense Department officials. These are, you know, from their perspective, those are personality failings that are limited to the lower ranks.
Sure.
Right?
You're giving a great deal of benefit of the doubt.
Okay.
So how many lawsuits does it take to bankrupt the country?
Well, what if they had done the right thing in the first place? You wouldn't have this money issue. The whole intent around it could have very well been that it was so much less expensive. They got it free originally.
Well,
it was supposed to be monitoring.
Right.
And if I may devil's advocate as well, even if the payout amount is to bankrupt the whole nation, it's the position of principle that there was an error committed and that they are trying to correct that error. So even if at the end of the day they're still not getting a monetary amount at which they deserve, it's the principle at which they are correcting, which I think for some of the veterans in this room, was all that some are asking for, that what they went through is acknowledged and respected and is the truth, if I may say that.
Right.
And take the politics out of that, the government says you're asking for more than you're willing to give.
Sorry. This thing's too good.
Go ahead, Mark. Yeah. 1 second. I want to apologize for this noise. They have a celebration of life going on that just has booked it too and seem to want to tune a piano that's already tuned. But I told them we're here, so hopefully it won't, you know.
Okay, thanks. It's
Look
over.
bad back here, maybe move up a little. We'll break in a half hour, okay? I'll leave it.
Sure. Yeah, so that, and we've been delving deep into fairly intense topics, and which is fantastic, and it makes us all more knowledgeable, and a little expertise is we've all picked up. But how would you perhaps coach us to give a elevator pitch type? I've got a minute to talk to somebody. What is the key issues? How do I get that across? Because all of us, I know myself, I get asked all the time, and like, what is this about? So how can I efficiently and quickly explain it without getting into the the deeper knowledge, which is critical and important? So what would you coach us for?
So
elevator pitch.
Yeah, there are a few. There's a lot of important context that MEFCON veterans need to keep in mind. I've spoken to many MEFCON veterans, and they approach this issue as though everyone is affected by this. And that's not the case. That's not the case. We do have to acknowledge that not everyone that takes this drug is going to be affected, right? If that were the case, this drug wouldn't have lasted more than a year, right? The reason the military has been able to get away with using this drug for so long, the reason the VA has been able to deny these effects for so long, the reason the drug companies have been able to elude legal liability for this for so long, is because these effects are not universal at prophylactic doses. At prophylactic doses. If I take a room full of people and I dose them with increasing amounts of Mefloquine, if I give everyone one tablet and I wait an hour, and those that have symptoms leave the room, and if I wait and then I give everyone another tablet, and those that experience symptoms leave the room, the room will progressively empty out hour by hour. There may be a few stragglers, but I can give them enough Mefloquine for the drug to overwhelm whatever biological defenses their body has against its toxicity, and they will experience the same constellation of signs and symptoms that more sensitive Mefloquine veterans experience. At prophylactic doses, our best estimate is that a minority of those who take the drug once a week will experience some degree of prodromal symptoms that require the drug's immediate discontinuation. And provided that they do as the drug label suggests and discontinue the drug immediately, like for example, civilian travelers, if they're drinking Mai Tais on the beach in Zanzibar and they are aware that something's not right and they were properly counseled, they'll stop the drug and hopefully they'll be fine. They may report nightmares to the drug regulator, but hopefully they won't be lasting and hopefully they'll make a full recovery. They may sometimes wonder in the future, gee, was I affected? But it won't be terribly disabling. They won't suffer disability from it. Now in the military, it's a little different because you don't have the option of discontinuing the drug, or you may not have had the option of discontinuing the drug. In many cases, as you suggested, you were ordered to continue taking the drug, right? So you were ordered to keep taking the tablet. In those instances, so in military populations, a larger proportion of those taking the drug are likely going to be affected by disability due to the drug, predominantly because of the conditions of ordered mandatory use and the inability of military members to follow the directions of the manufacturer in discontinuing the drug at the onset of symptoms, right? So what percentage of military personnel are going to be affected? We don't know with certainty, but based on my experience, counting the number of cases of disabilities in a well-defined cohort. So for example, in a given company, how many folks have been identified with disability, knowing that the company was ordered to take the drug continuously. Based on that and other corroborating data, which corroborates the rough order of magnitude estimate, I think it's probably going to be shown to be at least single-digit percentages of cohorts ordered to take a tablet a week continuously. Single-digit percentages will develop some degree of permanent disability. Now, what does this mean? If it's 10%, let's just say it's 10%, right? And let's suppose that that the other 90% may go on to develop things like PTSD and TBI under the same circumstances, right? So in that case, the effect of Mefloquine is going to be diluted in that group, isn't it, right? Because it's not everyone. that took Mefloquine that goes on to develop these problems. There's PTSD. There's combat trauma that does cause PTSD. There are IEDs that do cause TBI, and there are other psychiatric disorders that develop for the usual reasons people develop psychiatric disorders. So in the population, if the military or the VA, or if they hire some professors at an Ivy League college to study the very flawed literature on this topic, they are going to erroneously conclude that there's no effect due to Mefloquine. Right? Because we've studied these groups that have all been given Mefloquine, and we don't see a strong effect relative to groups that deployed to the same location and weren't given Mefloquine. Right? Okay. So this is the fundamental problem. This is why we're all here today at this stage in the fight, is because the studies that have been done, and the science that has been done, and the questions that have been asked have been the wrong questions. The question is not of soldiers given Mefloquine, how many go on to develop problems, right? Like, what is the risk of permanent disability among troops given Mefloquine? That's not the right question, because we know that if you take Mefloquine and you don't develop these symptoms, then it's not a problem, right? And we all know there are plenty of people that say, well, I took Mefloquine, I took it for a whole year and I'm just fine. What are you guys complaining about, right? We're all familiar with these people, right? Okay. Great, good for you. I'm glad you didn't suffer the life-changing, life-threatening disability that many of your fellow veterans did. Did you experience any symptoms at all during your use of the drug? No. Okay. So you were not subject to the drug company's warnings that if you develop psychiatric symptoms such as anxiety, depression, restlessness, or confusion, these must be considered prodromal to a more serious event and the drug must be discontinued. You are not part of that class of exposed people. You may have taken Mefloquine, but you didn't really take Mefloquine in the sense that it got into your brain and had an effect on it, right? And it's kind of the difference between a good scientist asking you, all right, have you been exposed to tobacco your whole life? And you say yes. And the doctor says, well, isn't that funny? You haven't developed lung cancer. Well, if your exposure to tobacco was you just worked in the tobacco fields of Tillsonburg, Ontario, for argument's sake, and you just picked tobacco, and you never actually put it into a piece of paper and rolled it up and lit it and inhaled it. If you were never exposed to inhaled tobacco smoke, then you're not at the same risk of lung cancer as people that did, right? In epidemiology and medicine, the type of exposure matters.